I wish to welcome you to Hunter College and to the teaching on the U.S. military bases in the Pacific.
And now we've come to 2009, to our fourth teach-in, which is to close U.S. military bases in the Pacific. We are so pleased to see so many of you here. This is a beautiful day where you could be outside, but you're inside, going to be informed and enlightened by a trio of three speakers who will speak on really some substantive issues. And we will also hear from Pete Bronson, who is a Korean War era veteran. And we have Matt Giella, senior at this school, who will play taps. This is an important day. This is a day that reminds us that war is agony in addition to being big business. When we think of the deaths of civilians and when we think of the deaths of military personnel, we are agonized and we want to stop that. Let us introduce Matt Giella, the musician, a senior at Hunter, who will remind us as he plays taps and as we look at this coffin, who represents not only the dead, but the living who are having a living death when funds for war are diverted from funds for education, for housing, for health care. Matt Giella, taps.
Vets for Peace has a Korea Peace campaign. Virginia and I are members of the steering committee. And we're working with a group called Rodino, a Korean community group. The members are outside in the ante-room, and they have flyers there. And we're working with them in part of a campaign to end the Korean War. The website is www.endthekoreanwar.com. We're working to replace the truce agreement that exists now with a peace treaty to formalize U.S. relations with North Korea and to unify North and South Korea so that families who've been separated can be reunited. Our work has brought us together with many who are working for peace and reduction in both conventional and nuclear armaments. In Korea, the costs of empire were extravagant, with 54,000 plus American servicemen members killed, over 100,000 wounded, 8,000 more plus missing in action, and more than 1.5 million Korean civilians killed. This resulted in our dictator in the South and theirs in the North. Our dictatorship in the South wound down, but the state of war helps preserve the dictator in the North. One of our efforts is that we're planning to send a group of veterans. We've gotten a positive reaction from North Korea. We're trying to get a group of veterans for peace from the States and from South Korea to meet with North Korean veterans somewhere in Korea this spring. The U.S. has been committed to military invention to control resources and expand power. Colonel Andrew Basovich says it best in his book, The Limits of Power, and you can hear his testimony on Rethinking Afghanistan, www.rethinkafghanistan.com. And in his book, he comments that the biggest problem is American exceptionalism, that our national security, which we're talking about, these bases, depend on our dominating the planet. He states that the U.S. has relied on diplomacy, hard bargaining, bluster, chicanery, intimidation, or naked coercion to achieve expansion. And that's also John Perkins in his book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, has also talked about that. So I was just going to skip over to this. Right now in Korea, there are a couple of issues that very recent At the beginning of December, they expect to start construction on a base for Aegis missile detecting destroyers, a naval base. And the island is probably going to be the quality of life on the island will be destroyed by that. But the reason I'm making the point about the missiles is that in order to, the United States has an interest in keeping countries like China from having access to the oil and the resources that they need. So in order to prevent that, they have to establish bases all over the place. So part of our effort should be to convince the president to live up to his words that he mentioned in Egypt in January of this year. He said to find common ground, to focus on we commit ourselves in an effort to find common ground, to focus on the future we seek. And how can you find common ground if you can't sit down at the table and talk with the people that you disagree with? So that's the point on that. These conflicts have resulted in significant losses both in terms of human lives and financial hardships on parts of society, and we were efficiently duped into accepting these as necessary events for the preservation of our way of life. All of these interventions and the creation of the need for the bases were predicted by the Project for a New American Century that was written in the 1980s, and they coined a phrase called full spectrum dominance, which was designed to ensure that the U.S. military would be in control of all levels of fighting wars, including outer space. One of our members, Bruce Gagnon, coordinator of Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, just came back from Korea. And he points out that there's another document from the Clinton administration, Vision for 2020, published in 1997, calling for the U.S. control and domination of space. So we feel that the effort should be to get the bases reduced. We have to talk about ways that we can go reach out to Americans and convince them to change the way they're living. Because if we keep on living the way we are, the demand for these resources that are limited and they're going to be the source of conflict is going to continue, and the bases won't close. In fact, we'll have bases on the moon. It's going to get worse. So we recommend our idea that the U.S. should stop spending $600 million annually to keep peace around the world, and we should get our money's worth for the $600 million that we're spending. The reality is that our spending hasn't increased global security. We still have one war after the other. The U.S. military interventions have caused disruptions in regions like the Middle East and Africa, and the best thing we can do is withdraw ourselves and allow these areas to come to terms. We also recommend supporting arms trade treaties to restrain the global sale and proliferation of armaments, working with the international community to upgrade UN peacekeeping, which is woefully underfunded and ill-equipped, shifting funds away from a military approach in Africa towards strengthening the capacities of African communities to meet their own needs, supporting an international peace process under the auspices of the UN to bring about the necessary dialogue and subsequent peace between Israel and Palestine so that both sides are treated fairly. The U.S. can reduce its military budget by 1/3 while still retaining the largest military in the world, and would still spend over 8 times more than the nearest other military power. U.S. military presence overseas has made America an international lightning rod for anger and resentment. This incident at Fort Hood, while it's not directly related, the fallout from it is an example of that. For these reasons, the No Bases campaign is important because it focuses public opinion worldwide of the need to replace a military presence that offers little in the way of security with a just and secure peace. I'd like to encourage people to stop at the table on their way out, and also 3 organizations, veterans groups that are working very hard on these issues are in dire needs of financial support. We accept Veterans for Peace accepts non-veteran members. All of you can join by filling out an application and sending in a check for $25 to our national office. The other groups that I'd like to mention, IVAW is also in Iraq Veterans Against the War. They've just reorganized themselves, and they have an office at 630 9th Avenue, and they're actively working to increase their abilities. Their struggle is really interesting because they're working with active duty soldiers, because that if the active duty soldiers decide the war isn't worth it, that they can change, we can reduce their interest in fighting the war and bring it to an end that way. They're also working on rebuilding Afghanistan, which was one of our goal was to go in and build a democracy there. And they'd really like to see it built. So they're working on that. And the last group is Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They've been one of the staunchest supporters of IVAW, and they're starting a national campaign among their membership to raise money for IVAW, so that these young people who've come back from the most recent wars and are suffering the trauma, large numbers of them, male and female, suffering all kinds of trauma, will be able to get the help they need and eventually be able to speak out. Because without their speaking out, people, I went to speak in a school the other day, they're tired of looking at old men. They'd like to see somebody from this war come and speak to them because they're closer to their age and they won't be getting advice from their father. So I really appreciate it if you could all join our groups and help us in our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pete Bronson. I would like at this time to acknowledge the presence among us of Annette Cox, who's a longtime partner of Alan Nelson. I think many of us we're familiar with him. He was a Vietnam vet much loved in Okinawa for supporting the struggle to close the bases there. Annette, would you just please let us acknowledge you, and by doing that, also acknowledge Alan Nelson. Thank you very much. I think we are now ready to begin the meat of our discussion. We have heard the taps. We have heard Pete Bronson, who spoke very well and gave us some ideas for action. And now I think we want to hear from our speakers who will talk about the New World Disorder, which is really what the bases represent, because they represent crime, accidents, violence against women, health and environmental damage, social and cultural dissolution and disruption, and they also represent the possibility, the imminent possibility of war again. Our first speaker will be Joseph Gerson, and I will just say that he is a member of AFSC and was very active as a Vietnam war resistor, but very, very active with that campaign. And he is will speak to us about what I call the lake of the American lake. In fact, all of our speakers are going to talk about that, because since the end of the Second World War and the destruction of the Japanese Navy, the United States has, in a sense, appropriated the waters around Japan, Okinawa, Guam, the Aleutian Islands, the Philippines.
I want to appreciate, as I begin, Granny Peace Brigade, your vision, your commitment, your dedication has been impressive, and I think it inspires many people. And too often we neglect national treasures, and I would say that Grannies for Peace is one of those treasures. I first traveled to Japan in 1984. I've been aware of issues around military bases from the Philippines and the Marcos dictatorship, but I was stunned to learn that the United States still had more than 100 military bases and installations in Japan, from Okinawa in the south to Hokkaido in the north. I listened to people from Guam, the Philippines, and that sort of launched me into work on military bases. I also learned there about the centrality of the U.S.-Japan military alliance, which was imposed on Japan as a condition for ending the military occupation in 1951. It was actually signed in secret in San Francisco because the Japanese people wouldn't tolerate it. Again, to understand bases, the United States has more than 1,000 military bases and installations worldwide. And a classic book that really everybody in the room should read is Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, which is basically how to maintain and operate the American empire. Drawing on old geopolitical theory, he says that the heartland of global power is in Eurasia. And if the United States is to be the dominant power, we have to have toeholds on the periphery of Eurasia. In Western Europe, read NATO. In the South, read the Middle East and now Central Asia. And in the East, read Japan and Korea, also the Philippines. In order to do this, we've done such things as taken a Class A war criminal, and made him Prime Minister of Japan so he could push through an extension of the alliance in 1960. Okay, let me speak quickly about the current situation. Well, maybe just say a little bit about Okinawa first. In Okinawa, you're dealing with a long history, right? Okinawa was originally an independent kingdom, essentially between Japan and China, heavily influenced by China. As an independent kingdom, it paid tribute to China. During the 200 years that Japan was closed, the government Tokugawa government in Tokyo essentially used Okinawa the same way we used it in Nagasaki, as a window into the wider world. They allowed some trade, limited access. But when we, quote-unquote, opened Japan with Perry's black ships, the warships that came in and said, you're now open, right? At that point, know your history. At that point, Okinawa no longer needed to serve that function. So the Japanese government simply went in and conquered Okinawa. They had their own language, forced all the people in Okinawa to speak Japanese, to take Japanese names. And in many ways, it's not entirely unlike the situation. It was used again in 1944-45 to buy time for the emperor system. The Japanese government put troops in Okinawa to try to slow the advance. In the battles that took place there, 1/4 of the Okinawan people were killed. 1/4 of the people. Many by Japanese forces as well as by U.S. forces. Then the United States began its military occupation of Okinawa. We'll see some pictures, and basically we moved in, took the Japanese bases, expanded them, put basically all the Okinawan people in concentration camps, took the additional land that we wanted for bases, and built those. The deal ending the formal military occupation of Japan in 1951-52 was that in order to kind of keep the peace in Okinawa, even as we had military bases across Japan, the greatest concentration would be in Okinawa. And you need to understand this element of racism here too, because the Okinawan people are a combination of Melanesian, Japanese, Chinese, a mixture, a little darker than many Japanese. So the deal was the bases stay, and actually the military occupation, formal military occupation, continued in Okinawa until 1972. And then under pressure from the Okinawan people, you had reversion. With reversion, the Okinawan people thought they were finally going to get rid of the bases. Wrong. Again, the United States, Washington, and Tokyo conspired to keep the pressure on. As you'll see, about 78% of the U.S. bases in Japan are in Okinawa. About 28% of Okinawa is occupied by U.S. military bases. And the vast majority of the 47,000 U.S. troops in Japan are in Okinawa. Now, I want to read a poem by Gary Snyder, written during the period of the continued occupation, of formal occupation. 120 schoolgirls committed suicide together here. I mean, people were encouraged for suicide by the Japanese military as the U.S. was winning. Dead now 13 years, those not-hearted little adolescents in their full purity died with a perverse sort of grace. Their sisters can be seen in the bars, the agreeable hustlers of peace. In the period that followed, as a consequence of the war, enormous poverty, estimates are as many as a third of the women worked as prostitutes for a period of time in order to keep their families alive, servicing, of course, the U.S. forces. You know, the history of rape and sexual violence in Okinawa is staggering. Now, in terms of the strategic importance here, what you see is that it's central to domination of East Asia and the Pacific. Throughout the Cold War, it was used to contain both the Soviet Union and China, but also as a jumping off point for wars and control in Korea, Southeast Asia, especially the Vietnam War, and as far away as the Middle East. Well, the Cold War is over, and now it serves to contain China and Russia, and to serve as a jumping off point for wars and support of wars in Korea, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, the Middle East, and even Afghanistan. It also serves U.S. nuclear warfighting, both in terms of the weapons that are brought in secretly. It's a major issue now in Japanese politics. Despite the Japanese government's non-nuclear policies, three non-nuclear policies, and also in terms of communication, the C4I, command control, computers and intelligence. It also serves as a place for training, jungle warfare and others. It serves as a cap also on Japanese military power. I mean, for one of the reasons we remain in Germany, one of the reasons we remain in Japan is to serve as a cap on potentially big powers. You should appreciate that despite Japan's constitution, which says that they shouldn't even have a military, they are between the third and fourth biggest military spender in the world, and with encouragement from the United States, their elites have been attempting to revise their constitution, and the new so-called democratic government is committed to doing so. What you see here is the victims from the Second World War in Okinawa. If you look at it, you see the number of civilians, 94,000 killed. I still bear injury from going into one of the caves where people were killed. These spaces, and I've got a few copies of this map, the dark brown there, those are U.S. bases in Okinawa. You see Okinawa, you see the bases. Imagine if that proportion of Manhattan or New York were occupied by Chinese or German, what you might think. This is a demonstration of 85,000 people in 1995 calling for the withdrawal of the U.S. bases. It shook the alliance to its foundations. This is the harbor where they want to build, the big picture is the harbor where they want to build a new base on top of reefs. It will absolutely destroy the environment. It will lead to extinction of animals, and of course it will mess up the lives of the people nearby. What you see in the lower left, you see an airfield in the middle of a city. That's Futemna, and that's sort of at the core of some of the current tensions. Basically, from that airfield, you have helicopters crashing into universities. You have constant noise pollution, terrorizing of schools. You may remember, this is the New York Times from April the 28th, when a U.S. publicity flyover rattles windows and panics public in Manhattan. Well, imagine this happening hour after hour, day after day, night after night. This is what the people in Okinawa live with. So my time is near an end here. I've sort of scraped the little edge here, but simply to say that the demands of the Okinawan people are that U.S. forces should get out. I should add that it's not only the list of crime, and one of the things that's here is just an incredible amount of crime committed by GIs, and the secret agreement basically not to try the vast majority of those. Last thing I'll say is that the problem, of course, is much bigger than Okinawa. There's an effort to kind of silence the Okinawan people by taking half of the Marines, moving them to Guam, overwhelming Guam. I mean, Guam is really under pressure right now. Small island, small population, a colony of the United States, and is being destroyed by the military buildup. And just the last thing to say, you may remember that the USS George Washington, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, is now based in the mouth of Tokyo Harbor. On its way over to Tokyo, there was a fire in the reactor. You're dealing with a situation where you have a military nuclear reactor at the heart of one of the largest megalopolises in the world, right? And we need to get that out. Thank you very much.
I now bring to the podium Virginia Rodino, who is with the Asian Pacific Freeze Campaign and also with Veterans for Peace.
So the Asia Pacific Freeze Campaign is one that's calling to freeze and then reduce the military spending of the 6 party talk countries, and these include the United States, Japan, China, Russia, South Korea, and North Korea. These are the countries which have on their own begun participating in the 6 party talks, and they account for more than 65% of global military spending. These 6 countries spend about $970 billion in 2008 on the military, and this figure is on the rise. These 6 nations we've chosen because they have entered the 6 party talks, and in their joint statement, which came out of these talks in September of 2005, the countries agreed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the normalization of relations with North Korea, and joint efforts for regional peace and stability. So we wanted to take advantage of the fact that these countries' governments were already in talks in order to create a pressure movement from below to get them to follow through and actually create the peace that they were talking about. This regional freeze and reduction will have a global impact as well. Because these countries account for over 65% of global military spending, with the United States actually responsible for nearly 50% of that total. We hope to set a good example if we're able to force these countries to freeze their military spending and then eventually reduce. In the last 5 years, every country but Japan has dramatically increased its military spending. Even Japan faces a powerful political movement in order to abandon its peace constitution. And the United States and Russia are the top arms exporters in the world, while China remains in the top 10. China and South Korea are also leading importers of military weaponry, and Japan's military budget, though it's still less than 1% of its GNP, it's still among the top 5 in the world. And North Korea devotes a considerable share of its budget to the military. So by redirecting the budgets of the leading arms-producing, exporting, and importing nations, the Asia-Pacific Freeze call to action is essentially calling to shrink the global military-industrial complex. Because we've seen that the U.S. manipulates the relationship between North and South Korea in order to meet its pro-imperialistic aims, I wanted to first start with a little bit of historical context of North Korea. The U.S. attitude toward the poverty-stricken East Asian country of North Korea demonstrates the contradictory stance of the U.S. government in this region. So after years of threatening North Korea over its nuclear weapons program, the U.S. under the Bush administration recently welcomed a deal reached between North and South Korea to work towards a permanent end to the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. And this deal involved North Korea promising to disable its nuclear facilities by the end of the year. U.S. hostility to North Korea has a long history, as we all know. Korea was divided in two at the end of the Second World War after 35 years as a Japanese colony. Soviet troops occupied the north, while the U.S. Army occupied the south. Both Russian and U.S. imperialism crushed every sign of resistance and established loyal regimes in their halves of the peninsula. Having received approval from the Russian leader Stalin, North Korea's Kim Il-sung began a war to establish a United States on the peninsula in 1950. And it was when the U.S. and China intervened that the Korean peninsula became the battleground for a proxy war between the imperialist powers. This resulted in the death of 3 million Koreans. During the course of the 3-year war, the U.S. considered using nuclear weapons on a number of occasions. At the height of the war in '51, the U.S. even carried out dummy nuclear bombing flights over North Korea's capital, Pyongyang. However, the war ended in a stalemate. Because of their memories of the war, now the North Koreans have and is fostered by their government, a hostility toward the United States. But we see that turning because of the strong international anti-war movements against Iraq and Afghanistan. After the Korean War, the U.S. stationed nuclear weapons in South Korea in violation of the Armistice Agreement. Although the United States announced that it was withdrawing its nuclear weapons from South Korea in 1991, it has continued nuclear exercises on the peninsula. Kim Il-sung, who learned his politics in the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggles of the 30s, followed the old Stalinist model and pursued high-speed industrialization centered on heavy industry in North Korea. He drastically curtailed consumption by the North Korean people. Just like in the Soviet Union, North Korea made good missiles but useless clothes and shoes for its people. North Korea's philosophy of juke, or self-reliance, emerged against this background. But this was an order to ordinary people to work longer and harder for the construction of the economy and the military-industrial complex rather than for their own needs. The endless productivity drives were given names associated with military operations against the US or the Japanese. A high level of repression was necessary to maintain a high rate of exploitation. The regime would brook no dissent, and any opposition factions were falsely branded as US spies and were sent to the gallows. The regime bolstered itself with purges, labor camps, and a secret police. And in the 70s, you can see that the North Korean economy outpaced the South, but eventually it began to reveal its limitations. And by the 1980s, the North's economy was on a downward curve similar to that of the Soviet Union. What the U.S. has done over the years has used the demonization of North Korea as a means of dealing with the post-Cold War order in Northeast Asia. In '98, the Rumsfeld Commission report produced by the U.S. Congress exaggerated the threat of North Korea's long-distance missiles. It was able to secure supplementary budget funding for the construction of the missile defense system, of which South Korea is a participant. South Koreans today no longer see the North as the major threat. They are more concerned about the possibility of a U.S. preemptive strike on North Korea. And war is still a threat today on the peninsula because the emerging US-Japan alliance and the conflict with China, which may lead to such a war. There is fear on the Korean peninsula that any such war would also involve South Korea. And it's the anti-war and the workers' movement in South Korea that will help to resist any attempt to lead to that war. I was in Korea actually when the first South Korean soldier was killed in Afghanistan after I think a suicide bomber tried to attack Cheney's car, I think it was, and spoke at an emergency vigil demonstration in Seoul. So you can see today that there is word that the South Korean troops are going to be redeployed to Afghanistan, and so there's a regroupment of the anti-war movement and the anti-war coalitions in South Korea because of that news. But preceding that, we see a couple of major movements that will help energize and bring greater experience and wisdom to this newly forming regroupment of the anti-war movement. And in particular, I want to talk about the Candlelight Vigil movement, which emerged in the summer of 2008. It was the biggest mass movement since the 1980s, and hundreds of thousands, and in fact, some estimates are millions, came into the streets to protest against the recently elected right-wing government of Lee Myung-bak. So ostensibly the crowds were protesting against the government's decision to resume beef imports from the United States, which had been banned due to fears of mad cow disease. But the anger and the slogans were directed at everything from education privatization to Lee's plans to construct an environmentally disastrous Grand Canal down the length of the country. The movement actually began online from a high school student's petition, and then escalated quickly into daily candlelight vigils in Central Seoul and the rest of the country. So from late May in 2008, people began to march, attempting to take their protests directly to the presidential residence. And very quickly, these demonstrations were made illegal, and the repression was enormous and very violent. Some of the major key leaders of the anti-Iraq war movement and the Afghanistan war movement were leaders of this candlelight vigil movement, and they were hunted down by the government, and there's only one outstanding activist who's sort of on the run from the government. The government has gone on the counterattack, arresting and intimidating scores of these activists. So, I mean, what led to this was the fact that Korean activists can't protest actively their government. So they directed their anger towards these U.S. beef imports, and from the outset at first it looked like it was anti-American sentiment, but really it was the close connection of their right-wing government to, at the time, the Bush government's agenda. And it was in that backdoor way that they were allowed to protest kind of the neoliberal policies that were happening in their own country. The start of the demonstrations was a combined result of a whole series of issues that had been thrown up since the election of this right-wing administration. From the moment he was elected, Lee began announcing a whole host of blatantly right-wing, neoliberal, anti-democratic, and pro-imperialist policies. And it was also in addition to the gradually worsening economic situation that was behind the sudden explosion of these demonstrations. So the popular anger gradually grew, and then when Lee traveled to the United States and made an agreement with Bush to allow imports of the beef, the anger basically exploded. And it was led in large part by school students in South Korea who had been suffering more and more the rigid discipline that, at this time, they're actually, school kids are packing breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then having to study afterwards, and then going to school at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And so the privatization of their education system was a way that was something that they couldn't openly protest. But through this U.S. beef import issue, because they were going to get a lot of this meat in their schools and would have to eat it lunch and dinner, that was again a backdoor way to protest these policies from their governments. And this movement grew and grew, and it encompassed a lot of both their own government and the U.S. imperialist drives and the militarization of their country that we've been seeing since 2002 and the death of 2 Korean schoolgirls that were killed by a U.S. Army tank. We can't isolate the anti-war movement or the anti-U.S. based movements. We have to look at the energy of the people and where they're allowed to protest and the dissenting space that they're allowed to occupy. And so it is through the anti-Iraq war movement that we've seen and through this amazing candlelight vigil movement. If you Google images and the candlelight vigil movement in South Korea, you'll see amazing photographs of ordinary grandparents and grandkids taking to the streets and workers taking to the streets in order to protest these policies. And it is through these movements that I think we'll see the energy and the know-how of how to organize against U.S. bases. The Korean government, the South Korean government, has plans to start work on a new base in Jeju Islands in South Korea. And where we can look to is this candlelight vigil movement to form the basis of a new movement against U.S. militarization and really continued occupation of their country since the Korean War.
Thank you very much, Virginia Rodino. I'm very happy to ask Ninotchka, who is a feminist, a writer, a lecturer, a journalist, a human rights activist.
I don't know why they had to locate their largest overseas bases in this very tiny archipelago. They could have located it in Germany, except that the Germans would have protested. So the poor Filipinos had to host these 2 largest overseas U.S. military bases. But in truth, as part of the colonization effort, there were a huge number of bases in the Philippines, military bases and facilities. Here's a partial list. All of that. Okay? And some more. Okay? And some more. Okay. This was the most famous Subic and Clark, because they were the biggest, okay? And one immediate impact of being the host of a foreign military base came in 1941.
This was how it looked when the Second World War broke out. And this was how Manila looked after the war. It was the second most devastated city of the war after Warsaw, Poland. Second most devastated city of the war. And I mentioned Poland in particular to let us think for a moment of the fates of these two cities, of Manila and Warsaw. Warsaw, the most devastated city of the war, Manila, the second most devastated city of the war. What happened to them afterwards? Okay. Of course, the United States returned to the Philippines in 1945. 1944, with General Douglas MacArthur, whom Filipinos used to call Doggy. We love nicknames. And immediately, of course, the bases were open. And to show you the tenor, the general ambiance of what it means for a U.S. presence, for the U.S. military to have a base in an undeveloped, weak, poor country. Here is a very nice picture. Okay. As you can, it's a hangover house. So they started building all of these huts to house dancing with prostitutes, hangover houses, beer joints, etc., and started the organized sex trade in the Philippines. Starting with 10 reed huts inside Clark Air Force Base. And this is now blossom, and by the 1970s, this was the scene. 1970s, $10, you get a beer, bottle of beer, you get lunch, and a blowjob under the table. They were very small people, and then you have these fields of murder. Sometimes they take 2-3 girls. Jeez. Very young. The youngest we found in the area was 11 years old.
Oh my God.
Of course, all throughout these years we were struggling against the bases, and this was a big, that's why I say this is a deja vu all over again for me, because I've been doing
this kind of talk practically all of my adult life. But the bases where the U.S. military wouldn't live because they had all the perks, plus they had all the excuses for the budget, etc., until, of course, nature took over and Mount Pinatubo exploded. That was the explosion. They had to leave. The indigenous people in the mountains said that the U.S. military was doing something in that volcano, I don't know what. But they knew that it was going to happen, and this was what happened right after the bases were closed. All of this R&R establishment and economic financial meltdown. So, for 5 years, there was no U.S. military presence in the Philippines. We did not die. We did not sink into the ocean. Nobody invaded us. Nobody attacked us for 5 years. And then, of course, we signed the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States. And this was between Joseph Estrada and Bill Clinton. My goodness, so 1998. And it was a treaty that was not to be ratified by the Senate. It was only an executive agreement. All right. But it could not be implemented because the anger over this was such that Joseph Estrada, the president, was overthrown in 2001. The people just went on a rampage and shoved him out of the presidential palace. So Gloria Macapagal Arroyo took over. We had 9/11. And then, of course, suddenly, we are in the middle of the war on terror. And yes. So now we can implement, the Visiting Forces Agreement could be implemented, and by 2002, 3,000 U.S. troops entered the Philippines after a very nice, nearly, 7 years absence. Yeah, so we are back there. Okay, there's George. In the Philippines. Okay. These are the specific provisions of the Visiting Forces Agreement. No passport visa required of any U.S. military personnel entering the Philippines. No visa required of any U.S. civilian personnel, government personnel. No test license required to operate U.S. military. I'm sorry, this should be vehicles. U.S. military vehicles, and there is U.S. jurisdiction over offenses committed in the performance of an order or duty. To give an example, if a soldier on the way to implementing an order by his commanding officer runs over a boy in the street, that is not punishable, okay? All judicial proceedings in the Philippines must be completed within a year, and offending U.S. personnel shall be held in a detention mutually agreed upon. This is very important because, do you know who these two are? This is Nicole, and this is Lance Corporal Daniel Smith. Nicole was 22 years old, very pro-American, went to celebrate her graduation in Subic area, and met 4 U.S. troops, ended up being thrown out the following morning, half naked, semi-conscious, out of a van. And as eyewitness said, she was thrown out of the van like a pig. And so, celebrated case of rape. This girl fought like crazy. She fought for a whole year to get the case to court. And Lance Corporal Daniel Smith was convicted and sentenced to 40 years. And the whole nation went, wow, wow, first time ever, ever. In 100 plus years. And he spent 30 days in a Philippine jail. 30 days. In the middle of the night, you know, this was near Christmas. People were celebrating, and some people, the government personnel took him out of jail and brought him to the U.S. Embassy. And then there were appeals and so on, and it dragged on and on. Well, he was in an air-conditioned room and quarters in the U.S. Embassy. And finally, Nicole just gave up and said, there is no justice in this country, and accepted settlement. 22 years old. Okay. One offshoot of the Visiting Forces Agreement, the return of U.S. presence to the Philippines, is the globalization of our sex industry. So these are women in Korea, Filipinas in Korea. Korea has started importing women from the Philippines. We have 9,000 women, Filipinas in Okinawa, who are serving the U.S. Personnel. And I'm very angry that activists in Korea and Okinawa will not even acknowledge this. This is how American forces right now show up in the Philippines, etc. Now, to summarize. I'm summarizing already. Do not give me like two. Okay, 2 minutes. Oh my God. Summary point 1. U.S. military presence overseas is part and parcel of imperialism's drive for dominance, control of world's resources. We cannot just look at it as a separate phenomenon and say we oppose this. If we are opposing this, we have to oppose the whole system. Summary presence number 2, U.S. military presence within the local setting, they become part of the ruling oligarchy and take on the class characteristics of that ruling oligarchy. For instance, in Clark Air Base, the base authorities would lease the land that they were not using to farmers from whom they stole the land in the first place. And they would take a cut of the harvest. And then, of course, we have the droit de seigneur, the right of the lord to the women of the village. So you have the whole vicinity of any base is surrounded by the sex trade. Very feudal. Summary point 3, sexual and menial exploitation of women. This is part of militarist culture and history. We know this. Okay. The struggle against militarism is part of the struggle against imperialism, against class, race, and gender oppression and exploitation. These are comprehensive struggles. You know, we focus on this closing of military bases, which is good. But let us not forget that we are engaged in a comprehensive struggle for social transformation the world over. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ninotchka Rosca. And now I think it's
5 years. And then, of course, we signed the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States. And this was between Joseph Estrada and Bill Clinton. My goodness. So, 1998. And it was a treaty that was not to be ratified by the Senate. It was only an executive agreement. All right. But it could not be implemented because the anger over this was such that Joseph Estrada, the president, was overthrown in 2001. The people just went on a rampage and shoved him out of the presidential palace. So Gloria Macapagal Arroyo took over. We had 9/11. And then, of course, suddenly we are in the middle of the war on terror. And yes. So now we can implement the Visiting Forces Agreement could be implemented, and by 2002, 3,000 U.S. troops entered the Philippines after a very nice, nearly, 7 years absence. Yeah, so we are back there. Okay, there's George. In the Philippines. Okay. These are the specific provisions of the Visiting Forces Agreement. No passport visa required of any U.S. military personnel entering the Philippines. No visa required of any U.S. civilian personnel, government personnel. No test license required to operate U.S. military. I'm sorry, this should be vehicles. U.S. military vehicles, and there is U.S. jurisdiction over offenses committed in the performance of an order or duty. To give an example, if a soldier on the way to implementing an order by his commanding officer runs over a boy in the street, that is not punishable, okay? All judicial proceedings in the Philippines must be completed within a year, and offending U.S. personnel shall be held in a detention mutually agreed upon. This is very important because, do you know who these two are? This is Nicole, and this is Lance Corporal Daniel Smith. Nicole was 22 years old, very pro-American, went to celebrate her graduation in Subic area, and met 4 U.S. troops, ended up being thrown out the following morning, half naked, semi-conscious, out of a van. And as eyewitness said, she was thrown out of the van like a pig. And so, celebrated case of rape. This girl fought like crazy. She fought for a whole year to get the case to court. And Lance Corporal Daniel Smith was convicted and sentenced to 40 years. And the whole nation went, wow, wow, first time ever, in 100 plus years. And he spent 30 days in a Philippine jail. 30 days. In the middle of the night, you know, this was near Christmas. People were celebrating, and some people, the government personnel took him out of jail and brought him to the U.S. Embassy. And then there were appeals and so on, and it dragged on and on. Well, he was in an air-conditioned room and quarters in the U.S. Embassy. And finally, Nicole just gave up and said, there is no justice in this country, and accepted settlement. 22 years old. Okay. One offshoot of the Visiting Forces Agreement, the return of U.S. presence to the Philippines, is the globalization of our sex industry. So these are women in Korea, Filipinas in Korea. Korea has started importing women from the Philippines. We have 9,000 women Filipinas in Okinawa who are serving the U.S. Personnel. This is how American forces right now show up in the Philippines, etc. Now, to summarize, U.S. military presence overseas is part and parcel of imperialism's drive for dominance, control of world's resources. We cannot just look at it as a separate phenomenon and say we oppose this. If we are opposing this, we have to oppose the whole system. U.S. military presence within the local setting become part of the ruling oligarchy and take on the class characteristics of that ruling oligarchy. For instance, in Clark Air Base, the base authorities would lease the land that they were not using to farmers from whom they stole the land in the first place. And they would take a cut of the harvest. And then, of course, we have the droit de seigneur, the right of the lord to the women of the village. So you have the whole vicinity of any base is surrounded by the sex trade. Sexual and menial exploitation of women. This is part of militarist culture and history. Struggle against militarism is part of the struggle against imperialism, against class, race, and gender oppression and exploitation. These are comprehensive struggles. You know, we focus on this closing of military bases, which is good. But let us not forget that we are engaged in a comprehensive struggle for social transformation the world over.
What do we do about the fact that countries want our bases disbanded, but still want the monies we send accompanying them? It's a question people often say, but they want or they need or their economy needs the financial input that comes from having the bases there.
First of all, in terms of who wants the money, the idea that that a country is uniform that it's monolithic, doesn't really play out. Whether it's the oligarchy, whether it's those who control the sex trade, they want it. But the nation as a whole, you're dealing with a form of military occupation. Let me say that, there was just recently the struggle over missile defenses in Czechoslovakia, and I was speaking to Jan Tamas, who was one of the leaders of the opposition to those missiles, and I asked him. I said, well, what's the foundation? I mean, why don't you want them here? And I said, look, my country has been occupied twice already during the 20th century. First by the Germans and then by the Russians. The last thing we need is a third military occupation. And we need to understand it in that context. In terms of the whether Hiroshima and Nagasaki were more devastated than Manila and Warsaw, it's in some ways it really doesn't matter. To appreciate, Hiroshima was destroyed in 9 seconds. The entire city was destroyed in 9 seconds. So plus people poisoned at this point into the third generation. So there's that. But on the other hand, the aerial destructions and the street-to-street warfare that took place in Warsaw, in the Philippines, the firebombing in Tokyo, which killed 100,000 people, civilians, in one night. I mean, we just need to appreciate, that war is an atrocity, and it needs not to happen. In terms of military budgets and military spending and social needs, I think the one thing I'll point to here is we all know we have a military-industrial complex. We know that Eisenhower, of all people, in 1960, which is to say 50 years ago, was warning about the subversive qualities of the military-industrial complex and how it was perverting and undermining democracy in cities and towns across the country. Well, the military-industrial complex has had 50 years to deepen its hold. And we are in the ridiculous situation of living in a country where our military budget equals essentially half of the rest of the world's military spending combined, and yet we're arguing over whether or not and how much health care any of us can get. You look at what happens in education, you look at what happens in terms of housing, you look at functionally 17% unemployment, and you know that there are many ways in which the essentially $700 billion a year that the military spends could be used in ways that stimulate employment and which will provide a foundation of security for future generations. Building the next F-22 or launching the next Star Wars satellite is going to help us. And just to say the really unhappy reality is that President Obama has committed to a 4% increase in the U.S. military budget. That has to be opposed. You oppose it by beginning to speak out against it. Congressman Barney Frank has called for a 25% cut in the military budget. That's not enough, but it's a beginning. It's something that we can focus on. Let me tell you, the military plans to increase the military budget by 25%, it's on the order of about $250 billion over the next 10 years. So the question is, how many of you have challenged your member of Congress or your senator on military spending?
If the war was a civil war in Korea, and if that's what you consider it, why does the United States have to sign a peace treaty? Please clarify. Isn't it a North-South issue to be resolved? Very interesting, provocative question. Virginia?
We're talking about the U.S. war on Korea from 1950 to 1953, and it hasn't officially ever ended, but it's not the civil war between North and South Korea. It's the U.S.'s war on Korea, that both the Korea Veterans for Peace campaign and also the Asia Pacific Freeze campaign is involved with to end the Korean War, the U.S. war on Korea. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah, sure.
Just to say that the war ended with an armistice agreement, not a peace treaty, and the armistice agreement was signed between China, North Korea, and the United States. South Korea wasn't involved. So the war is officially on. There's been no peace treaty, and so the call for signing a peace treaty is a call to formally end the war, and South Korea needs to be involved.
Right. And I think one of the main issues that we, especially in VFP, are working on is the reunification movement, right? So that it's not illegal for South Koreans and North Koreans to cross the border. So that's one kind of big sort of civil movement that has been going on since the Korean War that we definitely need to help support the reunification movement.
Now, can the three of you talk about, in terms of your particular interests, what is the role of the Obama administration? Vis-a-vis the bases, vis-a-vis the Philippines, vis-a-vis the six-party talk, vis-a-vis the possibility of signing the peace treaty?
I actually do not see much of a difference happening under the Obama administration. As we have seen a lot of was repulsive and anti-people elements in the Bush administration, these have been continued under the Obama administration. I think I would be a little bit more hopeful if on his first day in office he repealed the Patriot Act. Then I would be a little bit more. Although, I must say it's quite a relief to have a president who speaks in complete sentences. Bush was just impossible to listen to in that sense. But he's also not, Barack is opaque, You never really know what he's thinking of. Yeah. I speak very familiarly because I used to live 2 blocks from his high school in Hawaii. So I used to see him play basketball. Yeah. So, but perhaps a little bit less aggressive, although I'm not very sure about that, as he's thinking of putting in 34,000 more troops in Afghanistan. So this is a big conundrum. We would just love to have the first African-American president succeed and become really, really something, that we could take to our hearts for centuries to come. But I think the system, that's why I keep talking about the system, and that this is a comprehensive system, and we must struggle comprehensively. The system will not allow a man like that to do what he wants,
We've come out of a period of something like 8 years of a fascist government, and that government, the Bush government, led to a crisis of empire, both internationally and domestically. Look at the economy. And Obama is, in many ways, what you might consider a restorationist president. There's a reason he was backed by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. His role is to rationalize, is to take us back to the kind of multilateral empire that we had in the past. It's to establish some kind of rationalization of our domestic economy, but without really fundamental structural change. So we need to see him, I think, in that context. And frankly, it's good to be out from that fascist period. In terms of Okinawa, what you see is that the new government in Japan, the so-called Democratic Party of Japan, is calling for a renegotiation of the 1996 agreement that would have move the functions of Futemna Air Base, the one you saw with the airstrip surrounded by a city, to the area in Nago. And they basically are saying, let's just close down the bases, both these bases, and move the functions to Kadena, which is a huge air base. And the Obama administration is, to this point, saying, no, we don't reopen it. We've got a deal. We're going to build that additional air base, and that's what we're going to have. So we're going to see how that plays out, but that's where it is with Okinawa. I should say that you should appreciate that in Ecuador, the democratically elected government there was willing to make a deal with the United States. The United States could keep the base at Manta if the Ecuadorians could have a base in Miami. Needless to say, the Ecuadorians didn't get the base in Miami, and the base at Manta is closed. However, the Obama administration, kind of building on what Bush did, is now just recently announced 7 new bases in Colombia, and I learned last night there are going to be 2 additional bases in Panama. And then you have in Europe, where the Obama administration, while it removed the most aggressive missile defenses that were going to go into Poland and the Czech Republic, has moved to reassert the U.S. guarantees for those governments and the expansion, basically the expansion of NATO toward Russia, by bringing in Patriot missile defenses into both the Czech Republic and Poland. And remarkably, the Obama administration continues to support Ukrainian and Georgian membership in NATO. So it doesn't look good. The last thing just to say here is that my biggest concerns at the moment, in some ways, have to do with the question of jobs. If those jobs aren't provided, and we continue to have massive unemployment, think what the election in 2012 is going to look like. Think about what Rush Limbaugh is going to be saying. Think about the history of Germany and Italy in terms of the rise of fascism. We really need to protect against that. And then the last thing just to say is that I think as a movement, we need to be talking, not just responding every time to the next outrage, because it's one outrage after the next, but I think we need to begin talking about a really different role for the United States in the world, one which ensures security, because the U.S. people deserve security. And to remember back to the end of the Cold War, which was really ended on the vision, on the conception of common security. It was Olof Palme of Sweden who sort of led that. The idea that one nation can't be secure if its rival feels insecure. You get into that spiral, which leads, on the one hand, just to wasting all the money on militarism and all the suffering that comes from that, or war itself. And I would argue, I was arguing with a woman on the train down here this morning, we need to look at common security internally. Even the rich can't be secure if there's massive inequity in terms of income. We need to move from this idea of Ayn Rand individualism toward the idea of we all rise the boat together.
In the Foreign Affairs Committee is a feeling of extreme change from what has preceded before. And there are high-level talks are planned between the U.S. and North Korea. They're in the works now. So I would caution against, I think our work as a progressive movement is to find out where we can that's what we've been doing. We've had meetings, we met most of the day yesterday to figure out strategies that will work, specific strategies. And some of the things we came up with that I think can help bring about the change that Americans voted for in the election is to become more, get an organization like the Grannies, to have members write hundreds of letters, op-ed articles, and letters to the editor, even in small papers, and start to get the word out that way. The use of the internet. I saw something on the internet, I think it was David Swanson who mentioned something. I read it briefly while I was preparing my notes for this. And he talks about members of Congress. I've tried with Veterans for Peace in New York, unsuccessfully, to take our membership roster and identify people by their congressional district. 3 of us went to visit Anthony Weiner, Congressional District 9 in Queens, about 3 years ago when they were voting on one of the appropriations bills. And he told us that he would probably have to vote for it. And we made a presentation encouraging him to vote against it. And we left. The next week I read in the newspaper that he had voted against it. I don't know whether I'm not saying that I can take credit for that, but I think those are the kinds of activities that we have to get. And the other thing is up the next topic, the climate crisis. If we don't change the way we live and reduce the demand that's causing the buildup of the bases, then that's going to continue. So we have to find a way to address that, and we're not doing it. So those are my comments.
Let me go to I had said that there was a question specifically addressed to Virginia, and I hope that she will be able to answer that, and then we can go to the climate change question. Someone wants to know, Virginia Rodino, where do you get your analysis and knowledge about North Korea?
She's just smart,
I think that I've talked to a lot of South Korean activists, and I've done a lot of reading. I don't know where. I could, whoever wrote that question, I could talk with you. It sounds like a more in-depth question.
All right, maybe you can,
yeah.
She would be interested.
Yeah.
And then let me go to, so someone will, because I think someone has something specific in mind that they want to discuss. The climate change, it's either denied or ignored in the United States, but understood in all other countries. China is addressing the issue. We are not. Could the peace movement in the United States leverage climate change as a tool to shut down bases because of the severe impact they cause? And will the Asian nations join together environmentally when the United States remains isolated on this issue?
The Philippines having been hit by a 4th or 5th typhoon in like 35 days. We are very concerned, of course, about climate change. And fortunately, the paradigm with regards to the environment has been, in the Philippines, the paradigm in the Philippines, the perspective has been that of the corporate America perspective. You make money off nature. That's the main thing. You make profits. So destroy the corals, export them to Taiwan, blah, blah, blah. Same. And in the progression of things, we have seen this happen. Destroy your climate, destroy your people, destroy your nation, and that's it. You have a desaparecido país, because climate change will come and drown your country. So the only, I think, avenue for a certain degree of success on this issue is with people's organizations in the Philippines, the environmental groups. If the government itself is composed of very rich corporate people, landlords, monocrop, agribusiness landlords, so it's almost impossible to talk to them about environmental protection.
Although I don't think that global climate change has gotten its due in U.S. media, I don't know if it's being completely ignored. So in my day job, I work at a labor union, and I know that, in particular, the steel workers, for example, is a major U.S. labor union that has taken on the idea of green jobs. So it does connect back to what Joe said about the need to focus on jobs and the economy. And I think that the way the question was phrased, I'm not sure if the anti-war movement can do it alone. I think that we have to work with the labor movement and the student movement, for example, and join forces, but particularly workers. Just ordinary American workers. Now is a time to get them engaged in this idea of how climate change is affecting, our workforce and our ability to get jobs, and what the future looks like for the U.S. economy is tied into the climate change crisis. So I think it's really working towards green jobs and a green economy, and getting the workers, ordinary workers, involved in this debate that will hopefully, move them and engage them on the larger issues of bases and militarism.
Let me try it from a couple of different angles. First of all, I think it's not going to work to talk in terms of leveraging the climate change movement, because if you're coming out of the climate change movement, you'll see that a little bit as exploitative, won't you? So the need is to make common cause with, because we have shared interest. One of the things, I may step on a toe here, that our two-party system means is that it's extremely difficult for us to create a third party that will allow us to integrate the range of sectoral demands and to multiply our role and impact. I mean, that's supposed to be the function of a political party. I can say one project that's working in this direction is a thing called the Majority Agenda Project, which is working to integrate both climate change, or all three, climate change, peace issues, and healthcare, and bring them as a common agenda out. Just two more pieces. I mean, one obviously is that one of the greatest contributors to climate change is military. Especially when you look at the Air Force in terms of what that does. So, cutting the military budget, reducing U.S. reliance on militarism will move in that direction. Actually, two more things. We hosted a delegation from China last spring, just after Obama came to power, and we spent some time in Washington. And one of the elements of the agenda was around environment and climate change. And we met with a number of fairly senior figures in the Obama government, fairly senior figures in the Chinese delegation. And what was said was that the most important bilateral relationship in the world at this point is the U.S.-Chinese relationship. The Obama administration, we were told, has two major priorities globally and with China. One was restoring economic vitality, and the second was climate change. And they didn't want traditional security issues to destabilize that process. We're coming toward the Copenhagen summit, right? That's critical, and it looks like it's going to fail. The question here is whether the Chinese are saying we need to develop, and don't judge us the way you judge the United States. The problem is really both of them, and they're looking at a zero-sum game as to who gives what. The last thing I'll say is just after 9/11, I had the privilege of going to a roundtable in Hong Kong with a number of figures to try to make sense of what was going on. And there was this amazing man from what country is he from? I think from Sri Lanka, Chandra Muzaffar. And he began his talk by saying, in the Islamic world, we're struggling over what Islam is and what it's going to be. And in the West, you're dealing with flaws in your civilization that go back to Prometheus, the idea that we control nature, right? So, I mean, the reality is that it's late, friends. It's not 5 minutes before midnight in terms of climate change. It's 1 minute before midnight. And again, we need to do everything we can to try to preserve future generations. I've got grandkids, and so do you.
There is a question directed specifically to Ninotchka, and after that there will be a question about the U.S. peace movement. Ninotchka, in your discourse about the sex trade around the bases, we don't hear about the local young men. How are they affected, and what is their role, if any? Or what are they doing?
I actually took out the slide on gay prostitution. around the bases. The young men actually become also a large number of the young men in the vicinity of bases. They become part of the entertainment industry. They become waiters, they become musicians, and so on and so forth. You know, they drive the soldiers back and forth. For instance, the driver of the van out of which Nicole was thrown was a Filipino. He had been driving the soldiers for their night out. So they also become part of the structure of menial service to the U.S. troops. And then you had this other component of the sex trade, which is the gay prostitution. That's for the teenagers, but you also have the boy, you know, children, prostitutes. As I said, the youngest we found was 11, and that's not necessarily a girl. Yeah. So those are the things that happen to men. Psychologically, there is an infantilization of the male, because the women make the money and the women are sold. You know, they have absolutely no ownership anymore of the sexuality of the female of the nation. And I must tell you that there is a direct line from the start of the sex industry under U.S. imperialism in the Philippines to the current status of the Philippines as the top exporter of women in the world. Last year we exported 750,000 women. Oh yes, yes. And Gloria Macapagal Arroyo said that we will double that number this year. Do you understand what it means? You export women who are in the age range of 20 to 40. That is you are exporting uteri. Yeah, that's your future. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I would say the problems of the sex trade affect the military also. Our military is affected by it. We did a thing with the Grannies on October 13th, military rape in the military.
Yes.
Where 1/3 of all the women serving in the military experienced rape. Young women are afraid to go to the bathroom at night because they're going to be attacked by their fellow soldiers. So the issue of dehumanization that causes the transport of women all over the world, not just even in the states, the parts of the Soviet Union after the states broke apart, is a major part of the whole process of dehumanization that goes along with militarization. So I think there are issues. The sad thing is that most of the stories are not told, and there's also a great deal of rape. It isn't just female; it's male, but they don't talk about it. Yeah. So I think that's an issue.
Well, I think that if we go back to the annals of Babylon, you see that the military forces, when they conquer a tribe, they will kill the male prisoners or cripple them, but they will keep the women and the children. It's historically been part of militarism and military tradition.
Someone has a comment which I think will lead to, we hope, to some discussion among our panelists. Yeah. In order to weaken the power of the Pentagon and other other war-making institutions, the U.S. peace movement needs to build alliances with labor, students, women, churches, and many other sections of civil society, in order to build a mass movement powerful enough to challenge the Pentagon. Any thoughts about how this can be built, how to go about building this movement? this is a question addressed to all of you.
I'll try it. Again, in Europe and in Japan, where you have political party structures, it makes it easier in many ways to do this. I hate to be critical of our movement, but I'm going to be critical of our movement. For an awful lot of people, doing their peace work is what you do once a month. You go about your life and you don't do a whole lot. And the question comes down to how are you really going to live your life? Just to kind of pick up here, I want to suggest a book to people. It's called A Woman Among Warlords by Malala Joya, who is an incredible Afghan woman. And there too you can see something about the impacts of militarism on gender, on women. But this is a woman who gives essentially every fiber of her being to working for justice within Afghanistan and an end to the war. In order to do, there's only 38 hours in a day, right? So if you're gonna do the outreach to organized labor, if you're gonna do outreach to different religious congregations and denominations, if you're gonna talk to teachers, I mean, all these things that have to be done, it means doing it. And I'm afraid, this is the great Jules Pfeiffer cartoon, back from maybe in the 80s, our movement has in many ways forgotten how to organize. Many of us, I got my first training in organizing from labor, how to do community. Or the Granny Peace Brigade might do would be to run a seminar on organizing. And because it is the most vital, important thing that we can do.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
He wants to say something.
Go ahead, Peter. I think that's a key point. I think many of the people in this room were part of trade unions when they were working. How many of you are continuing working in your unions? That's another issue. I've had experience working with what I would consider one of the most recalcitrant unions, the United Federation of Teachers, and I'm still working with them. We have a committee. The name is kind of may make you laugh. It's the UFT Committee for Social and Economic Justice. And on that committee, a group of us have been working. Other members of this group have been working for the last 5 years. And last year, a year and a half ago, the Delegate Assembly took a strong position against the war in Iraq. Shanker would never take a position against the war in Vietnam, but now we got the union to take a position against the war in Iraq. Now we're working on getting a position against the war in Afghanistan. So I think that's one way of reaching out. We're working with a group called U.S. Labor Against the War. And to reach out to the labor movement, we're trying, for instance, there are many veterans in the unions, younger veterans, in their 50s, getting ready to retire, who could join the peace work. Part of our job, part of what I do is to try to reach out to people and change them. I don't think we're going to see a change, like a sea change, and get a third party, or there's not going to be a revolution in my lifetime. I don't think even my grandchildren's lifetime, but I think by working within these groups, that's at least something that won't depress people, and it gives you something to do, and it may have an effect.
I have a question. Thank you very much. I have a question.
Pardon me. I'm a veteran also. To that point that Mr. Gerson and Mr. Bronson just spoke up about, I'd like to remind people here that 3 days there will be a Veterans Day parade. Mr. Bronson, I think, will be involved. No, he will not be. If I'm not in jail, I will be there. I come from Staten Island. For the past 40 years, I've been confronting a very war-mongering, very conservative, very repressive community out in Staten Island. I still continue to do that. I don't consider myself a pacifist. If you read the words on my shirt, I don't mean physically fight as I did when I boxed many years ago, but stand up for the principles of democracy, of justice. Ms. Rodino, I really appreciated your presentation. My concern as I reach the end of my life is what happened in Vietnam when I was there. I was a combat infantryman, and I did take life. And I'm not proud to mention that, but in the course of being attacked, I shot back. I can never forgive the Vietnamese people enough for the shock and awe we put upon their lives, north and south, for 15 years. I apologize to those people. What do the people of the city of New York give back to the people of East Asia? 2 flags on that flagpole. One is a racist flag. It says POW MIA. There are no more POWs in Vietnam. There are no more alive MIAs in Vietnam, and yet the people of Staten Island continue to proselytize that idea that, watch out, the communist nation of Vietnam will hook up with the North Koreans if we move out of South Korea, and they will fight. I just want to finish this. So, for me, it is to engage in the conversation of what ethics are, what morals are, what life should be about. It's about the preciousness of life. I apologize to the people of East Asia, for my Korean veterans, and for my fellow Vietnam veterans for the destruction we put upon them. Please, come out November 11th on 5th Avenue and be a voice in return to our voice when I say, Mayor Bloomberg, you do not represent me. Pro-war people, you do not represent me. Stand tall and be with us. Be strong and show another sense of patriotism and principle that this country can stand up for. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
November 11th at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Black Veterans for Social Justice will be having an event at 55 Water Street, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. They will not be marching in the parade this year, and I will be with them. And we will have a program talking about how we can unify the veterans to get together to fight the changes that we need. And that will be the purpose, instead of marching in a militaristic parade.
Thank you. I think
film on Friday night about veterans. I know that
all right. Fine. Maybe we'll have a time for announcements when we close.
because it's really in keeping with that, because we can have a wider coalition. It's out there. And Bill Moyers presented a film for veterans.
The Good Soldier was the film.
Right.
Yes.
It's going to be repeated Sunday night at 7.
I will. If you will give me the announcement, I will announce it. I promise. But well, it's still the history of U.S. policy of hostility towards North Korea.
I mean, it's hard to answer the historical rationale. I'll try to summarize that at this point, the United States is using, the overall demonization of North Korea in order to reach its aims in that region. Particularly, as Joe mentioned, one of the key dynamics that we're aware of is the U.S.-China relationship, and so North Korea, remains a pawn in that because of its geographical location, and so the continuing Cold War culture is happening because now the U.S. is competing with China economically. So even though we wouldn't really need to be concerned with North Korea because of our military dominance, because of our competition with China in the region, North Korea becomes a pawn.
If I could just try a little bit more. Just as Virginia was saying earlier, at the end of the Second World War, the United States and Soviet Union each created client governments in Korea. We had a dictator named Syngman Rhee. and basically both of them were committed to unifying both Kim Il Sung and Syngman Rhee were committed to unifying the Korean Peninsula, but on their terms. And the question was who was going to invade who first. So there were numerous skirmishes before the North came south. So to understand that, to appreciate that during the Korean War, the United States destroyed 99% of the above ground structures in North Korea. I mean, 99%. We destroyed essentially everything standing in North Korea. So between the Japanese occupation and the destruction in that war, the North Koreans have some reason to be a bit anxious about both the United States and Japan, and to appreciate that, again, the United States prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war against North Korea at least 9 times over the years. So you've got that. And then just to kind of build out a little bit what Virginia was saying, because of the nature of diplomacy and politics, it's been impolitic to say that the U.S. military buildup in East Asia is directed against China. So it's always North Korea that is the boogeyman here, and the Japanese government has used this for sure. That said, having a nuclear-armed North Korea isn't sweet either, and it not only the immediate danger it poses, but if North Korea doesn't move to denuclearize, it puts huge pressure on Japan to go nuclear. If Japan goes nuclear, that reawakens the fears of China. So it's really essential to, on the one hand, move toward denuclearization of the north of the Korean Peninsula, but you only get there if the United States will practice denuclearization of the other nuclear powers.
We may be a gaggle of grannies, but we've gotten off of our fannies. We'll only rejoice for, we sing in one voice for no more war. We really mean it, no more war. And we mean business, no more war. No more. We're the raging grannies, and we're here to take a stand against the senseless killing raging in Afghanistan. Iraq is still a quagmire, and we sink into the sand. We rage to end all war. No more military action. We declare dissatisfaction with greedy politicians who make war with nukes and guns. We rage to end all war. We put away our knitting, tuck our grandkids into bed, throw on our shawls and aprons, put our hats upon our heads. We stand up for the casualties whose blood is being shed. We rage to end all war. No more militarization. We are raging at our nation for spending all our taxes to destroy, exploit, and kill. We rage to end all war. We stand here on this stage and wonder at the sad disgrace that civil liberties have disappeared without a trace. We're tired of old lies. We must put Congress in its place. We rage to end all war. With Obama in command, we'll continue our demands. With granny clothes and voices strong, we'll fight with all our might until we end all war. Until we end all war. We have bases in Hawaii and bases all around, in Peru and Timbuktu.
but we're not ending our activities and we're not ending our activism. I want to, before I thank Carmelina for granting us the space and support, I want to thank our
from Matt Giella, the musician, Pete Bronson, Joe Gerson, Virginia Rodino, Ninotchka Rosca. I want to thank the audience, those of you that are still here. Many have left, though I think they got the substance of our teaching. Of course, not only the No Basis Committee, but the Granny Peace Brigade, because although we might have, the No Basis Committee, might have initiated this event, when we do something, the Granny Peace Brigade pitches in, and they've done everything from decorations to food to outreach. So we are grateful to all of them. I want you, and Nidhi has advised me that there are lots of materials. There's homework to do. You've got to go out and do some work. So please take some of that literature. I also want to say simply as my own comment because I'm sitting here and I have the time to do it. We talk about change. Well, change means modification, which is always minimal. And minimal, yes. What we need is transformation, and that's what we've got to be about. We've got to change the society. We've got to change the roots upon which this society is structured. If we want to bring about